Welcome to the 2022 Silverbrook Cemetery Tour. This is a partnership between the Niles History Center and the Friends of Silverbrook. So I welcome everybody this morning. Like I said, I'm so happy. It's a little chilly, but it's not raining. It's a beautiful morning for a walk through the cemetery. So for those of you who may not know, I'm going to give just a little bit of cemetery history here. In 1836, George Bond purchased 6 acres for use as a public cemetery. Then he purchased some more shortly after. 2 years after that initial purchase, the lots opened for public sale at Silverbrook here. Since that time, there have been several additions to the cemetery, including the original Bond section. You have Old Ground, City, New, and Garden of Memory. Today, Silverbrook is still an active cemetery. The entrance that you guys drove in on over there is the cemetery's third. The original entrance was actually along where South 11th is today. We'll be walking by that in just a little while. The second entrance to the cemetery was right over here where we're standing today. And then they have the third one too, which is the one you see up in the front. This year, the tour is going to place special emphasis on the city section of the cemetery. Part of the reason why we met down here is the city section kind of goes back this way, so we thought we'd walk you part of the way too. The city section was laid out in the second part of the 19th century, and it's kind of interesting because at the time, the cemetery trustees hired someone by the name of Silas Ireland to lay out the area, and he created the first topographical map of the cemetery. He completed that work in 1878. So it was really the first official layout for the cemetery at that time. So we will be walking through the section, and we will be covering several families that are buried in that area. We'll also cover a couple families buried in, I think we hit Bond, and one family in the old section too. So, all right, we're going to start heading down this way, and as we head down this path toward the city section, I just want to point out, you'll notice on the left, you'll see a big sign. That is for the fence in the tree, and you can read about like what the significance of that was on the side. It's kind of like a historical marker in the cemetery. So, all right, we're going to head down this way. The marker that we're talking about is actually this one right here, and you'll see there are the small stumps around it too. So it's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of some of these markers, because in the section we're walking in, you might see some markers like this that have the tree look. So many of these stump markers that you see in the cemetery here actually belong to members of an organization called Woodmen of the World. They were founded in 1890 in Omaha, Nebraska, and he really, the guy who started it wanted a society that would clear away problems of financial security for its members. So, essentially, people who would join this Woodmen of the World Association, they could buy life insurance through the fraternal organization. So, they're still an organization that exists today. Actually, as of 2015, they started marketing themselves as a group called Woodmen Life. They also had a female auxiliary, too. Their history includes a number of philanthropic efforts. They did community outreach projects. They presented American flags, etc. But that an early benefit to the membership was you could get these headstones too. So this person that is buried here is part of the Westervelt family, and the members included in the burial here are James Dallas Jr., Ralph, Charlotte, Emma, James D., and Luther. So, like I said, you could get the life insurance through this group. So you'll notice in this section there are several of these like stump-looking markers. Kind of an interesting fact. The first person in Niles to claim this perk of being a member of this organization was a guy named Willie D. Warner. He is buried in the city section of 4719, and he died in 1891. He had only been a member of the organization for about 6 weeks at the time. So, just something to look for while you're going through this section. So this is our next stop. This is actually now the city section. This is City 14 over here. And one of the people we're going to talk about is a guy by the name of Jacob K. Brown. And his marker is actually the one right over there. But members of his family are all around here too. So one of the themes we talk about on a lot of these tours are people who were like early families in the village of Niles. So this is like the late 1820s, 1830s, etc. So these families that were part of the founding of the village of Niles. And Jacob K. Brown was one of those individuals. He was born in Liberty, Indiana on August 29th, 1810. He moved to Niles in September of 1831, just a couple years after the village plat was filed. He was married in the 1830s to Sarah Stith, and actually the ceremony was performed by Judge Green, who was the first judge in Niles. He was involved in a number of community endeavors, and actually, if you look at his obit, it actually says that Mr. Brown was too well known to require a lengthy obituary. So they just said everyone knew him. We don't have to list too many things he did. We know he was one of the first trustees of the village of Niles. He also, what he's really known for, though, is he built a number of homes and other buildings in the community, including the Pike House, which was a precursor to where the Four Flags Hotel is today, on Main Street there, Main and 4th. He built the Union School in Niles. He also built several buildings and structures on Main Street in the 1860s. He built a few homes for himself in the community. He built a house that was where the old post office is, like where the apartments are today. He built a structure that was there. He built a house for himself on the corner of 4th and Cedar Streets. And he also, according to his obit, and this is from his obit, so I don't know if this is an exaggeration or not, you know, sometimes they do in obits. It said he superintended the construction of 21 schoolhouses, a dozen mills, and at least 100 of stores, dwelling houses, and other buildings in his life. Brown Street in Niles, which is on the west side, was named for him. That is where his one of the houses he built for himself, actually the last house he built for himself, was located there. He died in 1890. But descendants of his family actually still live in the Niles community today, too. So, and he has a lasting legacy through some of these houses. Now, normally I show some pictures on these tours, and I will do some of that. However, I know it's really hard to see the pictures with the group size, so I also have a binder. And when we do refreshments or at the end of the tour, if you want to see any of these pictures up close, I will have that binder available and you can browse through it. But here's a picture of the Union School, which was the first high school. So the Union School was located near where the post office is today in Niles. The post office and those like high-rise apartments over there, that was all part of the schools. They eventually built Central High School over there too, so it was a precursor to all of those. Yep. So that's it. And like I said, I have a binder. We will pass it around later if you want to get a better look at some of these pictures. When we were planning this tour, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, you know, in this section of the cemetery back here, you see some of these monuments from the road, and we figured, you know, people drive by these all the time and probably wonder, like, hey, I see this really cool marker. I wonder who they were. So we thought we could highlight a couple of these. One of them being the Carberry one. You may also know Carberry Road, too, in the area. That's actually named after this family. They were another of these pioneer families in Niles in the, around the time of the founding of the village of Niles. So Isaiah Carberry was born in Kentucky in 1800. When he was a child, his parents moved to Ohio, where he grew up, and he married a woman by the name of Susanna Brickett. She was born in 1803. In 1821, they married in 1821. 10 years later, in 1831, they moved to Niles with their two sons, John and Aaron, at the time. In 1840, he purchased the land where his homestead was, out on where Carberry Road is today. That house eventually burned in the early 1900s. We know Susanna died in 1849, and a year later he married a woman, Catherine Kinsey. She was born in 1823. We know he was engaged in some businesses in town. He worked for one of the mills for a while, For 24 years, he was also the Justice of the Peace in Howard Township, too. So he's another one of these people who are really in the early founding of the area, the village area. Yeah. As I mentioned, at the time of his death, he died in, let me look at the time. He died in 1887. At the time of his death, his obit mentions that he's going to have one of the nicest monuments in the cemetery at the time. So, yeah. So also you'll notice the top of the marker is that draped urn. That's kind of some of that symbolism in the cemetery too. It's one of the most common symbols found in the 19th century American cemeteries too. So that is Carberry. So next we're actually going to talk, we're going to kind of turn around here and we're going to talk where you see the flagpole here. We're going to talk about a guy named Joseph Nolan.
Okay, we are at the gravesite of Corporal Joseph Albert Nolan. And the reason we've chosen this is because he's the only Medal of Honor winner in Silverbrook Cemetery. And we've got people going back all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Joseph Nolan was born in Elkhart in 1857. His family moved to Niles. Shortly after that, he became a blacksmith. He worked for Elijah Murray, who worked for the Studebaker Company, and then he went out on his own. In 1898, at the age of 42, he joined the Army. He enlisted in South Bend. They went down to Indianapolis, eventually to Fort Snelling. He was in Company B of the 45th Infantry. Now, I might add that this was at the end of the Spanish-American War. So after we conquered the Philippines with the help of the insurrectionists, they thought they were going to get freed. Unfortunately, we decided to keep it. And so now the insurrectionists are fighting us. And so we sent troops to quell the insurrection. And he was part of that group. Now, he was stationed in Luzon, in a place called Daet, spelled D-A-E-T. So, at some point in time, in 1899, he was sent with a patrol to go to Labo, which was about 22 miles south of there. Now, on their way there, they're almost to Labo, and they run into insurrectionists. Excuse me. And so they had to fight their way into the town. They were in the town for a couple of days. Then they were going to go back to Daet. Well, there's a river in front of Labo, the Labo River. So they get across the river and they're besieged by 500 insurrectionists. The insurrectionists had gathered a bunch of people. So a firefight ensues. So they are driving these people back. Corporal Nolan and two other soldiers did a holding action. In fact, at one point in time, he was firing his gun so fast that he burned his hands. He ran out of ammunition. And these tribesmen had bolo knives. This guy came from behind him to cut his head off, and he turned around and headbutted him. And eventually they got back across the river to Labo. So they were holed up in this church. Now the church is pretty secure. It's got 5 feet walls. And the reason they have 5 feet walls is because of earthquakes. However, they're out of food. So they're there for 2 days, they're out of food, they're being shot at every time they go for water, so they're like, we need help. So Corporal Nolan and a guide set out to Daet to get help. So first they have to crawl from the church to the river. Then they have to swim the river, with their rifles. It's 700 feet wide. So they finally get across the river, and then they constantly run into insurrectionist patrols. And so they manage to get that. They're on the road to Daet. They run across another patrol, and they capture the patrol and proceed to Daet. And they're just outside of Daet, and they run into a relief corps. A group was coming to rescue the lost patrol, as it were. And they had 18 men. So Corporal Nolan says, yeah, you're going to have to get more men. So they go back to Daet, get more men. They march, and it's about 22 miles. So they march with Corporal Nolan leading them. They go back to the church, they rescue the men, and they come back. So, in 24 hours, Corporal Nolan had traversed that 22 miles 3 times, so he'd gone 70 miles. When he got done, there was blood rolling out of his boot. But the captain of the relief corps said, "You'll get the Medal of Honor for this," and he was right. And the citation reads, "Voluntarily left shelter at great personal risk, passed the enemy lines and brought relief to besieged commands." Now I've got another thing here that's... General Bates of General Bell's brigade said it was the bravest piece of work ever performed in the archipelago by one man. Now, on a personal note, he was married 3 times. His first wife died in 1893. His second wife divorced him in 1899. His third wife survived him. And he had 4 sons. He died in 1921. We know that he lived on South St. Joe Avenue, and later, around 1912, moved over to Mulberry Street, which is now 14th Street, sort of in the area beside school. So I guess that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
How are you related?
No, I'm not related.
Are there any family members still around?
Yeah, I believe his first wife, Anna's buried around here, right? Yeah.
But in the area, I don't know that there are any that we know of. Yeah. All right, so thanks for gathering. The next person that we're talking about is Sally Moody, and that is her marker right here. Okay. So Sally Moody, we know, was born in Tennessee in 1865. And we don't know much about her early life. According to ancestries, her parents were Jane and Henry Moody. We think her mother might have been born in Tennessee and her father was born in Mississippi. We don't know, like I said, as much about her early life. There is a local woman who is doing some research on her, and she could not be part of the tour today, but she's trying to find out more information about her. And one of the things she wants to find out about her, or find about her, is a picture. We do not have a picture of her, but we'll talk about her story a little bit. We know she came to Niles in the early 1900s, and she worked for several families in the area. And including, we know, the Milburn family, who had a large house on Yankee Street, too, and some other families. Like I said, we'd like to do more research. We even know that in the 1890s, she bought a house in the area, too, and had a house in Niles. She died in South Bend on October 23rd, 1927. After her death, she left her estate minus the funds needed for a funeral and burial, and the amount amounted to about $6,748.43 to the Niles Library, saying that the library had always made her felt welcome, and it was a place where she felt the most at home at the time. At the time of her death and the time of this bequest, it was the largest individual donation to the library aside from when the building was built. And the library that we're talking about at the time would have been the large Carnegie Library on 4th and Main. Many of you might be familiar with the Carnegie Library, too. And actually, at one time, the library, the Carnegie Library, had a Sally Moody room, and they opened it in 1954 during the 50th anniversary of the library. Another little interesting fact about her, in 1928, at the time after her death, I mentioned that in her will she had left some funds for a funeral, and she left the rest to the library. She did not leave any funds for a marker at her grave. And so in 1928, a group of African American citizens in Niles actually petitioned a probate judge to put this marker at her grave, too. Saying that, you know, there was no mention of it in her will, that they felt she needed a marker, and that's the marker that we see today. Like I said, we would love to do more research on her, and there's someone in the area who is trying to do more research on her. So if you know any more information about Sally Moody and her connection to Niles, we would really love to hear it. So we're going to start heading along parallel to South 11th here. Before we do that, I just want to turn around and point out the Scala marker there, because I think that's another one that you see from the road. That is the marker for Frank Scala and Anna, who you see there. Frank Scala was born in Niles in 1861. He was the youngest of 7 children, born to Joseph Scala. According to his obit, he was actually one of the few remaining Nilesites christened in the old St. Francis mission, which was a structure built on the site now occupied by St. Mary's Church. He had operated the Scala Furniture Company with his 3 brothers until the plant burned in 1913. The store had been founded by their father. We also know he served on the Niles police force during 1926 and 1927, and he was a member of the Knights of Columbus. On May 21st, 1890, he married Anna Brand in Illinois. They were married for 53 years. There are members of the Scala family still in Niles today, too. But that's another one I think you see from the road a lot, so I wanted to make sure we talk about that. We're going to talk about another early Niles family who still has descendants in the area today, too. And that is the Finley family. And two people I forgot to point out on the way when we were heading this way, just down that way a little bit, was Greenville and Melissa Hill Finley. So they are part of this family, and we will talk about them. They have descendants in the area today, and we actually have some of those descendants on our tour today, too, here. So we're going to talk about the Finley family. So just a little bit about them, because several members of the family are buried here at Silverbrook Cemetery, too. And I mentioned Greenville and Melissa, they were down there, but they are a part of this family, too, and we will talk about them. Pasquale Finley and Sarah Newt Finley were kind of the matriarch and patriarch of the family. They are the first ones that came to Niles. They came to Niles in the 1840s. We know that in 1848, Pasquale worked for the Michigan Central Railroad. He was grading land for the new rail lines in Niles. By 1850, he had purchased land east of Niles near the present-day airport, and he was a farmer dealing in cattle. Pasquale and Sarah had 8 children: Ophelia, Mary Catherine, Zerilda, Edward, Greenville, Sarah Frances, Premilia, Richard, and John. So there are many descendants of the Finley family, and like I said, there are still descendants in the area today. I did want to point out one of their sons, Greenville Finley. He was born in 1838 in Ohio, and that would have been before the family came to Niles. He was married to Melissa Hill on April 4th, 1860, and it's interesting because there is a connection, their family connection connects them to Lottie Wilson, who we are going to talk about the Wilson family a little bit later on the tour, too. So, Melissa Hill Finley was born in 1838, and her family was also from Ohio. They moved to Niles when she was a small child. According to their obits, they had, according to, I think, Greenville's obit, it said they had 11 children, and Melissa's obit said they had 10 children, too. And so, like I said, there are several descendants of the family, too, and buried all around here. Sarah and Pasquale Finley and some other members of the family are buried at the Barren Lake Cemetery, too, a little bit. But we know after Pasquale Finley's death, Sarah married Daniel Purcell and lived until 1895. Several descendants of the family still live in the area today. They host an annual reunion, sometimes held here in Niles, too. And in 2017, the Niles City Council proclaimed September 10th as Finley Family Day. Yeah. Does anybody want to say anything about the family?
I will just say,
Yeah.
some of you probably remember, you were at Niles High School, you will probably remember my grandmother, or if you both, which there's a tournament today at 12:30, Norma Taylor is my grandmother, who is a direct descendant of the Finley family. And we also have the distinction of being one of the oldest black families in the state of Michigan. So we're pretty cool. That's all I got.
No, that's, yeah. So there is like a lot of connections, like you said, to the state and to Niles area. Another person I want to point out while we're here too is Thomas Travick right there as well. So we'll talk about him for a minute. I've got some pictures too, and we'll show some of those pictures. Like I said, you may have a easier time seeing it later. We have some pictures of, this is Edward and Greenville Finley. This is from the History Center collection. Yeah. And members of Greenville's family. And then we have a picture of Finley Family Day, the City Council in 2017, with members of the family there as well. Oh, I'm moving up. What's up? Okay, and I wanted to talk about Tom Travick, because Tom Travick built the Silverbrook Chime Tower, which is over in the Garden of Memories section. And like I said, you can see some of these pictures earlier if you miss it. It was Tom Travick moved to Niles in 1919. He was a stonemason, and we know he was part of the crew that built the bank building on the corner of Main and 2nd Street. Today it's a gym down there right in downtown Niles. He eventually started working on various projects at Silverbrook Cemetery, and in 1936 he was hired to construct the Chime Tower. We know the Chime Tower originally had a sound system that could be used to broadcast during funerals at the cemetery, and a PA system so you could reach various staff as the cemetery was growing too. Tom Travick married local resident Anita Finley, daughter of Ada and Clarence Finley, too, and stayed in the Niles area as well. So he is buried over here with members of the Finley family. And so many of you might remember Tyler Refrigeration. So the mausoleum and then the surrounding area, that's where several members of the Tyler family are buried too. And so I thought I could talk a little bit about, in the mausoleum are interred Jerry Tyler, his wife Mary, and their son Michael. So we know Jerry Tyler was born in Saginaw, Michigan on September 21st, 1900. His parents were Leon and Minnie Tyler. He graduated from high school in 1918 in Traverse City, and he actually was in the Naval Academy for 2 years. After leaving school, he was a salesman in Muskegon. And we know in the mid-20s he also conducted a retail business in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. In 1927, he founded the Tyler Sale Fixture Corporation in Muskegon Heights. They became known for the production of store refrigerator display racks. In the early 30s, they moved to Niles, and they quickly sought to expand their business. They purchased another local business called Dry Cold Refrigeration Company. And 5 years later, they changed the name to Tyler Fixture Corporation, and then later they were called Tyler Refrigeration Corporation. They remained in Niles until 2009. We know Jerry Tyler, the company did. Jerry Tyler was active in the local community. He was a member of the draft board number 3 in the county. He was on the Aviation Advisory Committee. He was on the Michigan Board of Aeronautics. He was a trustee of Alma College, and he was a founder of the local YMCA, and he was also a member of the state YMCA committee. I also found, according to his obituary, the first year of YMCA operations here, the entire budget was provided by the Tyler Company as well. He was also a member of various clubs in the area. He served on the city council for 3 years, beginning in 1934. On February 11th, 1926, he was married to Mary Witt Tyler. We know she was born in 1906. She was the daughter of Vernon and Rosa Witt. She was involved in the Niles community in a number of women's groups, including the Ladies Reading Club. She also wrote poetry. She published a book of poems called Colored Shawls and Other Poems in 1936 and dedicated it. It was dedicated to Jerry Tyler. Their son Michael was born in 1934. Now, Jerry Tyler was president of the Tyler Refrigeration Company until his tragic death in 1946 in the Chicago LaSalle fire. He died, his wife Mary died, and their son Michael died in the fire. After their death, his brother Robert Tyler actually took over the company, and he was president until 1969. At one time, though, Tyler Refrigeration was the global leader in the commercial refrigeration business as well. So, as I mentioned, the mausoleum is here, and it was in memory of Jerry, Mary, and Michael. But then there's other members of the family buried around here as well. I just wanted to point this out before we start heading around this way. We actually have an early postcard of the cemetery here too in our collection at the History Center. And it shows a view from this angle, too. And you can see that big cross, too. So I wanted to point that out. If you're ever wondering if you see the postcard, we've used it in our advertising. It is supposed to show this angle. And the cross is for the Scorse family, too. And we know some of the members of that family are buried here. John, James, Leah, Catlett, Alcides Jerome Scorse, and Minerva Almeida Scorse Clay, and Mary Ellen Bacon. If you're familiar, if you've been on the tours before, we've talked about the Bacon family, another family in Niles who were lawyers and judges early on. We don't know as much about them, but in the research, we do know that, for example, in the 1870 census, John is listed as a cooper, and Alcides is in the Army. In 1882, we know Minerva married a man by the name of Martin Clay. And according to a newspaper article in the Chicago Tribune, it took place at Minerva's brother-in-law's house, Edward Bacon. He was married to Mary Ellen Scorse Bacon. And he was a lawyer in the area, too. So that's who's buried over there. But I think it's interesting because we have that postcard, and so people do ask sometimes about where is that in the cemetery. You can see it's right over in this area. So next, we're going to head up the hill a little way, and we're actually going to go past the receiving vault. We're going to come back to the receiving vault, but we're going to go up to the hill and talk about the Chapin family.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Good. A little chilly out today, but beautiful fall colors. I am representing Emily Coolidge Chapin, who is married into part of the Chapin family. If you're from around here, you've probably heard of the Chapin Mansion, and that is in fact the same name. I was born as Emily Coolidge in Edwardsburg on March 16th of 1849. To put that sort of into context, that's just a year after the California Gold Rush. So California actually plays two roles in my life. One of them is that year, and one of them is at the very end of my life. I was born in Edwardsburg to my father, who was a judge, and my mother, and raised with a number of siblings as well, who I believe we will get to hear about in the not-too-distant future. Is that correct, Molly?
Yeah.
Excellent. I went to school here in Niles with Niles Schools, and then continued on my education at the Kalamazoo Seminary. Very big difference. The Kalamazoo Seminary, where I studied music, specifically vocal and instrumental. I was a beautiful and accomplished soprano singer. At the age of 24, I married Charles Chapin. It was 1873, and together we had 8 children. In 1902, Charles was the only one of 4 children to still be surviving, and therefore he inherited the mansion on 5th Street and Main Street, right downtown Niles, from his parents, Henry and Ruby, who are buried kind of to the back here if you walk around when we are finished. We lived in Chicago by that point. We had been living in Chicago for about 5 or 6 years, and so we really just came back to the Chapin Mansion to stay whenever we were back in town. I and my husband were very involved in philanthropy and donating money and also volunteering. And one of the big things that we did was we sang at both the Presbyterian and Episcopalian churches here in Niles and in Edwardsburg, and then also donated quite a bit of money to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and also the Chicago Civic Opera, both of them involved obviously in music and part of my passion and love in life. My brother Orville, who again you will hear about here pretty soon, is buried right across the way here. He had 2 nieces. I was especially proud of these 2 nieces. One of them, Florence, followed in her father's footsteps and continued on to be a writer and also taught English, literature, and public speaking here at the Niles school system. And then his other daughter, Florence, was actually the first public librarian here in Niles. In 1913, Charles died of old age, and I basically just lived in Chicago after that point. I was very involved in philanthropy in Chicago, specifically in something called Chapin Hall, which used to be an orphanage and half asylum, and became largely just an orphanage. I was a strong believer that children deserve to have fresh air and a more open setting, which was a pretty progressive idea at the time. And so I donated $70,000, which helped kickstart that entire project and changed lots and lots of people's lives. I was also involved in the YMCA, churches there, and Boys Home in Chicago. And now, for those of you who like ghost stories, here's just a little bit of a ghost story. I moved into the Drake Hotel in Chicago. Have you ever heard of the Drake Hotel? Yes. Yeah? You're familiar with the ghost stories? It's one of the most haunted hotels in Chicago, they say. I, of course, am not one of the hauntings. But in 1920, which was very soon after it was opened, there were rumors and an urban legend of a woman in red who unfortunately found her lover kissing somebody else on New Year's, went up to the 10th floor and jumped. And the ghost of the woman in red is still said to haunt the 10th floor. So if you go, watch out for her. A more tragic event that happened also at the Drake Hotel was the parents of Bobby, I want to make sure I say it right, yes, Bobby Franks. If you've ever heard of the Leopold and Loeb murders, Bobby Franks was a 15-year-old who was murdered in cold blood, and unfortunately the press had an absolute heyday with that, so much so to the point that his parents, Jacob and Flora, moved into the Drake Hotel and spent their time pretty much sequestered in that hotel, which was pretty much at the same time that I was there. I moved sort of back and forth, but spent some time out in California, which is where I died, in Pasadena. There's that California reference again. In 1925, right after my 76th birthday. So a nice, peaceful end to my life. My family then brought me back here into Niles, and I am buried right here. We had 7 of my 8 children survive us, and so they were all in attendance at the funeral, as was Reverend Jones, who was the Reverend at the Presbyterian Church in Edwardsburg, to which I donated the church in my father's memory. Thank you so much for learning about Emily Coolidge Chapin today. Again, lots of family history, and you can still go and see the Chapin Mansion, where I spent a decent amount of my time. Thank you so much.
We're gonna head down to the receiving vault area, and you can, I think we have the receiving vault open, and you can grab some cider, and then we'll get you a little closer to your car, too. So
This one. Sorry, honey.
We'll start heading back this way. I'm going to talk about one person who's buried up on this hill here. I have a picture of the marker, but it is Ebenezer McIlvaine. We know he was born in 1807 in Vermont. He was a Quaker, and he was a judge in the area. But an interesting story about him was he played an important role in an event in our area that's really important in really our local history, but also in national history. And that was called the Kentucky Raid. If you come to the Fort St. Joseph Museum, we have some exhibits on this, and it's more in Cass County, but we do talk about it in our exhibits at the museum. So in 1847, a group of men from Bourbon County, Kentucky, traveled to Cass County, and they were seeking the return of enslaved people who had fled north seeking freedom. We know they seized 9 men from 4 different sites. A group surrounded them, and they were forced to submit their case to the Cass County Court. The usual judge at the time was absent, and so Berrien County Commissioner Ebenezer McIlvaine was brought in, and he ruled against the Kentuckians. The freedom seekers were able to leave for Canada, and we know the Kentucky men sued a second time in 1850, and they were actually awarded payment at that time, and it actually contributed to a federal 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, as they call it. It required that enslaved people be returned from northern states to their southern masters, and they greatly increased penalties for failure to do so. But McIlvaine was a part of that, and he actually ruled against the Kentuckians in this case. We know he died in, what year did he die? In 1874. But we don't know much about his life, like later in life. We know in the 1860 census he is listed as living with a wife, Ellen, and children, Anna and Richard. We know he's buried here at Silverbrook with a Eula McIlvaine. We believe that's his daughter-in-law, his son Richard's wife. She died in 1892, and a Samuel Gray. He was born in 1829. He died in 1880. Samuel Gray was married to their daughter, Anna McIlvaine. His father was actually Isaac Gray. He's the oldest marker in Silverbrook Cemetery, and we will actually be going by that in a little bit. So, that is McIlvaine, and he is right up there. The Hunters. Oh, while we're here too, you can also see back behind you where the yellow mum is. That is a marker for some members of the Hunter family. If you're familiar with the Hunter Ice Fest, it is actually named after this family that started the Hunter Brothers Ice Company on Barren Lake. They harvested ice, mainly for use on the Michigan Central Railroad, too. So that's the Hunter family. And again, we have this festival in Niles today. It is named after this historic family. As Emily Coolidge Chapin mentioned, we were going to talk about some members of the Coolidge family that are right over here. And so you can see them here. Let me get to my Coolidge stuff. These are some as you mentioned, Emily was part of the Coolidge family. So buried here are members of, is Orville Coolidge, and he is on the end there of these 4 markers. He was born in Edwardsburg, October 9th, 1839, to parents Judge Henry Coolidge and Sarah Meade. He worked as a lawyer, like his father did, and a circuit court judge. He was also mayor of Niles in 1890. In 1906, he authored a book titled The 20th Century History of Berrien County. He studied literature at the University of Michigan. He also attended law school in Massachusetts. In 1867, he married Katie Pettingill, and they had 3 children, Florence, Oral, and Clarence. Florence was born December 15th, 1868. She was also an author. She taught literature and public speaking in the Niles Community Schools. Clarence was born in 1873, worked as an attorney, much like his father and grandfather. And then Oral Pettingill Coolidge was born in 1881. She was the first public librarian in Niles. She worked at that Carnegie Library I showed a picture of early on, too. And I've got a picture of her here. This is actually her in the Sally Moody room at the library. Again, you can see this up close in a little bit. So she was the first public librarian in Niles. Orville Coolidge was Emily Chapin's brother. Emily Coolidge Chapin's brother. So members of the family. There's other members of the family buried a little farther on as well. Behind you, you'll notice there's members of the Pettengill family. Orville Coolidge married Katie Pettengill. So all part of that larger family here too. While we're here, I wanted to point out a couple markers. You see the benign marker, and then we're going to talk about these markers right here too. So the benigns are Evan and Evelyn Benign. Evelyn Benign was born Evelyn Beale in 1826, and then Evan Benign, Dr. Evan Benign, was born in 1821 in Richmond, Indiana. He moved to Niles with Evelyn in 1858, and he started a medical practice. He served in the Civil War. He was surgeon of the 2nd Michigan Infantry. He later advanced to Chief of Staff and Division Surgeon of the 3rd Division, 9th Army Corps. After the war, Dr. Evan Benign was actually elected a Michigan State Representative, and he was also a state senator. He was postmaster in Niles for 12 years and mayor for 3 different terms. You may also be familiar, their son Frederick, was a renowned eye doctor, and he practiced in Niles for a long time. He also served as mayor of Niles too. He's interred in the mausoleum over in the Garden of Memory. He was born in 1863. Let me see what else I have on Evelyn too. So next, right next to me here too, are members of the Lardner family. If you were on the tour last year, we talked about some of the Lardner family, and I mentioned that Ring Lardner, his parents were buried over in this area, and this is actually where his parents are buried and his sister Lena too. So if you don't know, Ring Lardner was a sports journalist, and he was a writer of short stories, novels, songs, and plays. During the early 1900s to the 1930s, he was an extremely popular author in the United States. He was really a household name at that time. But he was born in Niles in 1885 to parents Lena B. Lardner and Henry Lardner. So we know Lena B. Phillips was her maiden name. She was born in New York on June 2nd, 1843. Her parents were Reverend Joseph Phillips and Eliza Thompson. They were on the tour last year. They moved to Niles in the 1850s, where Reverend Joseph Phillips was rector of Trinity Episcopal Church. He served in that post until 1866. We know Lena B., she taught for the public school system here in Niles. She also taught Sunday school at Trinity, and she was a music director for the church. She married Henry Lardner at Trinity on November 6, 1861. Henry was born near Niles in 1839. And his father, also Henry, had moved from Pennsylvania to the area, and he established a home along the Dowagiac Creek and the Kinsey Creek, where he operated a carding mill. Anyway, Henry's mother had died, and then they actually sent him out east to be educated. He came back to the area to take over the family farm, too. And then he married Lena Lardner. Their house, their family home that they moved into eventually, is still standing on Bond Street today. That's the house that Ring Lardner grew up in, too. They had 9 children. 6 survived. William, Henry III, Lena, Reginald, or Rex, Anna, and Ringgold, or Ring, too. We know Lena B. Lardner was also very gifted in music, and she wrote poetry books. There were 2 books she had published, Sparks from the Yule Log and This Spray of Western Pine. So she was very heavily involved in the local area, but she was also very interested in music and writing, and we believe she passed those gifts on to her children, too. Also buried here is Ring's sister, Lena Lardner, named after her mother. She was born in 1875. She was also interested in music, like many members of the family. She was the organist and choir director for Trinity Episcopal Church, and she taught piano at her home and at the local school, and she even directed the orchestra at Niles High School for a time as well. So that's those 3 markers right there. So I wanted to point this out because we kind of talked about the family when I talked about McIlvaine, the judge. And then we'll get up to the end of the tour. But This is the oldest marker in Silverbrook Cemetery. I know we've talked about this on tours in the past, but it's interesting. Isaac Gray was born in Ireland in 1794. We know they came to Niles in 1828, where they operated a general store. He also served as postmaster. We know he died in 1830, and he was originally interred at the First City Cemetery near the corner of 4th and Oak Streets. Today it's the parking lot for the Presbyterian Church in that area. And we know he was reinterred here at Silverbrook Cemetery after it opened. His wife, Martha Gray, was also born in Ireland in 1796. She died in Niles in 1858. Their son, Samuel, I mentioned, he's buried with the McIlvaine family. He was married to their Ebenezer and Ellen McIlvaine's son, or daughter, Anna. So that's the oldest marker in the cemetery. Next, we're going to go up this way, and we're going to talk about the Wilson family, and you guys are going to get to see a new marker that was put. Okay, so we have a sign, and I think I pointed this out if you were on the tour last year, for the Wilson family and for Lottie Wilson. But I will note that the Lottie Wilson, her marker faces this way. We actually, last year, I mentioned that they were raising money to put a marker for Henrietta Hill Wilson, and I will talk about her. That's Lottie Wilson's mother. That marker is now installed. It faces this way because that's how Calvin Wilson's marker is faced. And if you note, the entrance to the cemetery changed several times, so some of the markers face the other way because of the older entrances to the cemetery. So you are welcome to come around this way if you want to see Henrietta's marker. That was installed in the last year, too. So, thought we could talk a little bit about Lottie Wilson and her family. You can see we have the sign here, and then we have this new marker. Henrietta Wilson, she was a Hill. She was born to, let me find her family. She was born to parents Henry and Elizabeth Hill. She moved to Niles in 1846. I mentioned earlier when we talked about the Finley family too. Greenville Finley married Melissa Hill, so that's the larger connection. So Lottie Wilson is a descendant of is part of the Finley family too. So through that Greenville and Melissa connection. So Charlotte Lottie Wilson, she was born in 1854 to Calvin and Henrietta Hill Wilson. Over time, she became a nationally known artist and activist whose works were displayed throughout the eastern United States. We know her father, Calvin. This is his marker here. And again, if you want to see it, you can come around. It does face the other way. He was born in Halifax County, Virginia in 1828. He moved to Niles in the late 1840s. Henrietta was born in Ohio in 1836. She moved to the Niles area in 1846. They married January 6, 1853. We know Calvin operated a barber shop in downtown Niles. I have a picture of it here, and again, we've got that binder after if anyone wants to see. It was located near the corner of Bird and Main Streets. Today it's the Mason building down there, and I think On Base Productions is in that. It was in the basement next to that, but that's what's over there today. And we know that Henrietta actually worked at the barbershop, and it said in some of these city directories she was a hairdresser, and she worked as part of his business as well. We know Mr. Wilson was a charter member of the Niles Harrison Lodge, the first African-American Masonic lodge in the state of Michigan. We also know that Lottie's parents, Henrietta and Calvin, they were involved in early civil rights efforts. They were part of the group in 1867 that petitioned in the local paper to build a better school, saying basically if the schools in Niles had to be segregated, then we need a better school for the African American children in the community, and eventually it led to the building of Ferry Street School as well. They advocated early on for that in the 1860s. So, we know Lottie Wilson was born in 1854 to them. Their family house was on the corner of 5th and Ferry Streets. I have a picture of Lottie Wilson. She's on the marker too. You can see her as well. We know she was the first African American to attend the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. She was primarily a portrait and landscape painter. She was also known to dabble in the painting of fine china, needlework, and sculpting. She taught classes as well in oil painting, pastels, ceramics, drawing, and painting conservation. We know she created busts and paintings of important historical figures, including Frederick Douglass, Phyllis Wheatley, and Crispus Attucks. She was also, aside from her career as a painter, she actively campaigned for women's suffrage. We know she held talks at churches and art studios as well. And she was part of the National Association of Colored Women, because at the time African American women were not always welcome in the white-led suffrage organizations. So they organized their own group. The NACWA, as they called, were formed in 1896, and they fought not only for suffrage, but also for equal rights for African Americans. She was the first art superintendent for the group, and we know she organized exhibits for their national conventions. She was a delegate to the 1899 National American Women's Suffrage Association Convention as well. And she actually has a famous event there. It was covered a lot in the local papers in the Grand Rapids area. We know there she proposed an amendment. She was protesting the policy of separate railroad coaches for African American women in the South. And at the time, a lot of African American women in the South were not allowed access to separate ladies' coaches, but they had to travel in cars with men, placing them in a vulnerable position. So she was protesting, saying if we're going to go out and support suffrage, then this policy needs to be addressed. Susan B. Anthony unfairly declared the issue beyond the scope of the organization, and it was tabled on the grounds that it was not directly related to women's suffrage, although it definitely was. Although Wilson's work led her across the country and abroad, she returned to Niles often. We know in 1906 she married Daniel Moss, and she moved back permanently to the area. She continued to exhibit her work and hold classes at her family's home on the corner of 5th and Ferry Streets. And she died January 16th, 1914 of cancer. Her best-known work is called is pictured right here. It depicts the famous meeting of Abraham Lincoln and Sojourner Truth. She painted that piece in 1902, and she was actually invited to present the piece to the White House. So she went and she presented it to Teddy Roosevelt at the White House. We know that it hung in the White House for some time, and then we know it was gifted to a member of Roosevelt's staff. His name was Major Loeffler. And then we don't really know what happened to it until the 1980s, when an art conservator bought the piece at an auction in D.C. On the back, it said it was painted by Lottie Wilson of Niles, Michigan. And so this art conservator contacted some people in the Niles area. I think she contacted the library and the museum. And thanks to the efforts of one of her descendants, Alice Finley Brown, this is how her story resurfaced. Like she was able to do a biography. The family already knew about Lottie Wilson, and that is how eventually the painting was able to come back to the Niles community. The Niles Library bought it in 1982. If you come to the Fort St. Joseph Museum, it is on display there at the time. Lottie Wilson is buried here at Silverbrook Cemetery with her parents, Henrietta and Calvin. And like I said, for a long time, Henrietta didn't have a marker. We believe she had one at one time, and it probably deteriorated. And so in the last year, actually, some money was raised, and they were able to put a new marker here for Henrietta. She's also buried with her children, Dennis, Daisy, and Callie Huggart, and like I said, her parents are here too, and you can see them here, right there. In 2016, Lottie Wilson was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, too. And I actually have a picture here, if you'd like to see. At the ceremony in 2016, members of living relatives of hers were able to go and actually accept the award for the nomination as well, too. So, yeah, that's Lottie. We have a historical marker here in the cemetery, too, for her. And that really concludes the end of the tour here. I thank you, everybody, for coming. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you want to see the pictures, I'll have the binder available.
Yeah.